Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Valda Ford, and your interviewer today, RUCHIKA Tomar. What a beautiful name.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. So we're talking about A Prayer for Travelers. This is an amazing book, and it tells some stories in ways that are quite surprising. What drove you to write the book?
Well, I grew up in Southern California in the Inland Empire, so that's about 3 hours from Vegas, 2 hours from the border. So kind of a similar psychic landscape, especially in the late 80s, early 90s of isolation. And I wrote this book in my 20s, and when I sat down to write a novel, those images that I grew up with and the experience of kind of traveling around the West with my girlfriends when I was young and vital, a memory by then, was just so, it had just kind of stuck in my mind. And kind of the darker aspects of that as well, becoming a woman kind of in that landscape.
Yeah.
I think I just kind of wanted to revisit that moment and think more deeply about that experience.
Well, I was surprised at the beginning. Well, let me just say to the people who are listening, the fact that you laid out the chapters differently than would normally expect, and what you called a collage. So that was interesting to me. And being someone who's tried to write, and I've started and stopped and come back and move things around, is that how you got there, or you just decided those chapters and those numbers made the most sense?
Yeah, I did write the novel originally in a linear progression, a chronological order, but I was thinking a lot about, for me, like structure comes through character, and I was thinking a lot about Kale and how she would be able to kind of revisit this moment of trauma from a later point in her life. And I was thinking about the way that I and my girlfriends tell stories, which is sometimes not in a linear fashion.
Yeah.
And at the time I was working for a mental health and substance abuse clinic, and I was really interested, coming from kind of a lower middle class background, I was interested by how the treatment that young people were receiving at this center, because they had access to mental health care, was so different than kind of the way that I and my friends were experiencing like moments in our past of trauma. So I was talking to trauma specialists, and I was really interested to find out that the way, if you go to a trauma specialist, the way that they are taught to kind of address trauma, I had imagined was, somebody comes in and says like, okay, I'm ready to talk about the events of like, June 10th, 87 or something. And so I was interested to find out that actually they don't talk about it for a long time.
They let it unfold.
Yeah, they want to make you feel comfortable and give you coping mechanisms. And so I thought it would be, that kind of clicked with me about the right way that Kale would kind of like get to settle in and tell her story the first time that she would kind of revisit this traumatic moment in her past.
Okay. Well, I know that took me off guard when I read about your beginning. So you are telling the story of being left. Just tell me about the trauma as it tells us. When you were talking about living and traveling, and what traumas are you trying to discuss in the book?
Well, I think the experience of being a young woman in America and society, kind of organized the way that we are. We're sexualized very early. We are kind of acclimated to understanding that we are in danger once we get to a certain age, and sometimes that age is much younger than, we have the capacity to kind of see ourselves as adult women, but we're expected to we're being seen by men or perpetrators, whatever gender they happen to be, as adult women. So I think that in itself is kind of, an adjustment that sometimes we're not ready for. And however that kind of manifests for women in their own personal lives, it can be traumatic.
Yes.
And I think a lot of women, as we've seen kind of in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, have just kind of, had a difficult time coming forward with their stories and kind of making sense of their past. And sometimes, it's taken them years to kind of address it.
Right. Well, I know when you talk about trauma and you talk about the ability to talk about it. My background is nursing and public health. And so we really talk a lot about being trauma informed as healthcare providers, but having also worked with therapists before personally, then I know that most people don't know when they come into the room that I'm going to let you get to it the way you need to get to it. It might take today, you might be ready, or it might be months later. How did you feel about that when you said that you had a thought about what would happen, but then when you actually experienced it, it was different? Do you think that people who read this will be able to get the sense that it's okay to talk about their trauma, that it's better for them to get it out, whether it's in a linear fashion, a non-linear, told through your eyes or those of others?
Well, I think kind of having the experience of working in that mental health clinic and just, the experience of being a woman and holding stories for my friends, I think I wouldn't want to push anyone to read this book and have them feel like they need to tell their story if they're not ready to tell it. But I want them to know that someday there's going to be somebody who you can trust, who can listen to it. If that's just one person, if it's just you coming to terms with it privately yourself, that's fine. I think there's no right or wrong way to kind of deal with that experience. And I know, kind of after, again, the Me Too movement, everyone's kind of being pushed to talk about experiences. And I actually think talking about it before you're ready is not necessarily helpful, just because it's in the public discourse right now.
Right.
I don't think, that people should feel pressure to kind of talk about experiences that they don't want to yet, but just to know that they're not alone and that all women are kind of in this experience together. So I hope that we're going to be there for each other and kind of create a compassionate community.
Well, I hope so. I still see a lot of blaming going on, and unfortunately, victim blaming. The numbers are so much higher than anyone wants to believe or accept. But I think it's great when there can be the opportunity, because someone reads your book, that someone feels what you felt and understands the courage that it must have taken to be able to talk, to read, to write, to know. So how long did it take you to write this?
It took me 10 years. And just to be clear, this is obviously a novel, so it's fiction.
Sure.
So this isn't my life story.
Right.
Yeah, it did take 10 years just to, I think the topic was obviously one that I wanted to approach, respectfully and carefully and thoughtfully, and kind of manage with my own experiences. And it took me a while to kind of actually be able to write some of those scenes, which I would think that it wouldn't. I didn't anticipate it being that difficult to do. But it actually was. I think, it was me being ready. It took a couple years for me to be ready to write certain scenes before I could do it.
Yeah. Yes, I imagine. If you're talking about the different places that you stopped, if you're in a hotel and then there's a door latch that's closing and it's okay, now I'm here by myself. What's going on?
Yeah.
That would be pretty interesting. I know as I travel, I am told to take pictures of hotels, because sometimes bad things happen to women or children if they're trying to explain, especially if children are taken and exploited. There are law enforcement people who can even look at hotel rooms and say, okay, I saw that in that picture. Or I saw the woman who was bound in a room that looked like this. It must be that hotel chain. Did you ever talk to people who had continually bad life experiences? We're going through so much with, I call it slavery. And what are we calling it now? Trafficking. Did you run into many people who talked about that as well?
Yeah, I think there's an idea that, maybe some women have had a bad experience, but as long as you're a woman, you're a target in this country, so that doesn't necessarily end once you've once you've had one bad experience, you're off the hook. No, so I think a lot of women, a lot of women that I know have certainly had a number of encounters. I guess the hope is that we become more and more careful as we grow older and, take more precautions. But, I mean, again, not to be like victim blaming, there's no necessary precautions that a woman can take when there are people who want to do you harm. Like, there's nothing, it's not really about, your actions. It's about if there's a predator out there, they're going to find a way to get to you. So, yeah, unfortunately, it's a continual, I mean, I don't know what to say to women who have been continually, experiencing this kind of trauma, except that I'm sorry and, I see you and I hope that you're going to, find a way out of the darkness.
Right. Now, you use California as your backdrop. And is that because that's mainly where you lived, or you just like the idea of setting it there? Because when I think of California, as most people are wrong to do, we think of certain places as being less horrific, less likely, more free-spirited and live and let live Californians, but no one is free from it based on geography.
Right. Well, actually, Pomac, the fictional town, is set in northern Nevada, but kind of on the Nevada-Cal border. And I did specifically kind of want to set that in Nevada as the original setting where the novel opens because of that reason as a Californian. I understand people who aren't from California, just kind of have an image of California as surfers and palm trees, and they don't really have an understanding of kind of just how socioeconomically, class-wise, race-wise, California is incredibly diverse. So I did want, I traveled all over, obviously I've been to Vegas many times, Reno many times, and the landscape of Reno is kind of more similar to certain areas in California 10, 15 years ago before, as with the economy, different parts of California grow and collapse continually. So I felt that was right.
Now, you said something earlier that was interesting. You said traveling. What did you made a comment about younger or more vital? What did you mean by that?
Oh, well, now I'm 35 and I'm definitely feeling things changing. All sorts of things changing. I think back on, the kind of decisions that I made when I was younger, which were not the smartest, and then B, just how careless I was, in both like a positive and negative way. Like, I took more chances, obviously. I felt more free to kind of go wherever, do whatever. And now, obviously, I'm a little bit older and wiser and slower as the years go on,
I think that, I wouldn't have taken you for 35. You look very young.
Moisturizing as much as I can.
That always makes a difference. What would you tell people who are thinking about writing a book? I mean, it's the great American dream to be able to sit down and actually finish, put pen to paper, or I guess now talk into the microphone.
Yeah.
What would you say about the process, and what would you do differently if you're going to do something again?
Oh, gosh. I don't know what I could do differently, because I think the first novel is kind of like a unique challenge. Even if, you'll go on to write many novels, it's kind of just teaching yourself how to do it. And part of that is kind of like psyching yourself up day in and day out, months after months, year after year, to believe that, you're not wasting your time on this effort. I would tell people to not, I don't know where I heard this, but, keep your chin down in success and keep your chin up in failure is kind of what that's kind of my philosophy, I guess. I hate people who say that, but I do think about that quote a lot, because the tendency is when things are going bad to just believe that they're always going to go bad, but I think you just have to kind of keep the faith, and especially in novel writing, it always kind of takes longer than you think it is, even towards the end, when the novel was done, I would think I'd just, take one more read through before I hand it in, or, every round of edits, and it just always kind of took longer than you think it's going to. So kind of knowing that in the outset, and I still tell myself that as I'm trying to start the second novel, and I'm hoping it's going to go faster, but I'm like, work as much as you can on it, but don't forget, especially if you're young, to live your life and